Good. So what we'll do today, we'll continue on sea ice, and we'll start off again with stuff that we kind of think we know and we understand. But don't be fooled. We also try to get across the message, and we'll focus a bit more on that in the second hour, that there's so many things we don't know, in particular about Southern Ocean sea ice. So just in case, if any of you had started their PhD not working on sea ice, always feel free to change your topic. There's lots of work still to be done. So what we'll do today, we start off very briefly. We had some discussions last night, and I got some questions. I just want to very, very briefly look at the molecular level of melting, just to give you some sort of intuitive understanding as to what actually happens if we add salt to water and why the interface is always at the melting temperature and stuff like that. We then have a quick session on snow, because snow really is important for Antarctic sea ice. And we'll do both these things quickly on the blackboard. And then it's over to Martin to talk about sea ice dynamics. And then in the second hour, we'll wrap up with dynamics and we talk about polynyas. And then afterwards, we probably have some time to talk about anything that either we find interesting or you find interesting, or both, ideally. And so our offer would be, if there's any topic that you think you would like to hear a little bit more about regarding sea ice, please let us know. We'll ask at the end of this first hour whether there's anything you'd like to have a quick session on in the second hour. And if you don't tell us what you find interesting, we just do what we find interesting, and then you can't complain afterwards. Is that a fair deal? Great. Okay, so let's really very, very briefly get started to look at what actually happens at an interface between ice and water. So in ice, our molecules, our water molecules, are nicely arranged as a crystal, sitting here, and then we have our liquid water down here with H2O molecules freely floating around. And whenever the system is in equilibrium, it doesn't mean that nothing happens, but what it means is that these molecules will have a distribution of energy. Some have a little bit more, some have a little less, and the same in the water. And at exactly 0 degrees, the same amount of molecules in the ice has so much energy that they move into the water, as molecules in the water have little energy so that they move into the ice. So there's a constant exchange of molecules at the boundary, but at exactly 0 degrees, nothing changes. It's in equilibrium. And if we make the system colder, then the molecules lose energy and more molecules attach to the ice than the other way around. That's the sort of really basic level understanding as to what happens at such an interface. Now, one thing that we could immediately learn from this, if we have an ice cube like this, then the molecules in the corner here, they're a bit stretched, and so they're a little bit less tightly attached to the matrix of the molecules in here. So it's easier for them to leave the ice, and therefore there's a so-called freezing point depression whenever there's curvature involved. And that's the reason why whenever you put a perfectly square ice cube into your glass of water, it'll get round over time because the molecules at the edges are less tightly attached to the ice matrix, and so they find it a little bit easier to get out. So now you have a fun story to tell your friends whenever you have a drink and the ice cubes get round and you wonder what's going on. And if we now add salt, so these are I put them round, they are not round, but salt molecules into the water. What you can basically imagine is that these salt molecules make it harder for the water molecules to attach to the ice. And depending on what you like, you can imagine either that they simply get in the way or that they actually form bounds with the water molecules and sort of try to hold on to the water molecules. And so if we start at 0 degrees and we add salt, the same amount of molecules still get out of the ice, but fewer molecules get back in. And therefore, if we have salt water and freshwater ice at 0 degrees, this interface slowly retreats. And in order to maintain phase equilibrium, we basically need to slow down or take away energy from the water molecules in the water. And then at minus 1.8 degree, again, there's equilibrium between the molecules that get out of the ice and that get into it. Does that make sort of at least intuitive sense? Yeah.
When you say, if I got it right, when you say salt blocks.
Yeah, that's a sort of, it's what happens on a molecular level, of course, is much more complicated, but I find it helpful at least to have some intuitive understanding. Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering if it means like it's mechanically blocking it.
No. It basically forms bounds with the water molecules, and so makes it harder for them to move into the ice matrix. They need a little bit, they find that state energetically actually quite attractive to just stay in the water. Yeah. Good, that's all I wanted to say. Very quickly, to give you some intuitive understanding that what happens at such an interface, that there is a constant exchange of molecules and also some intuitive understanding as to why the freezing point of salt water is below that of fresh water. And the second thing I briefly wanted to do is looking at snow. Two things there. I first wanted to look at which role snow plays when it comes to ice growth. So what we had yesterday, we just had ice, and we said we have a temperature gradient with some surface temperature, some bottom temperature. And we said the heat flux in the ice can be approximated as the heat conductivity of the ice, surface temperature minus bottom temperature, divided by ice thickness. Now, what happens if we add snow to this? So we have some snow on the ice now. Let's assume for now that the surface temperature of the snow, because it's somehow in equilibrium with the atmosphere, is similar to what the surface temperature of the ice is. Our bottom temperature never changes. It's always minus 1.8 degrees. And so we now get a different temperature profile. And you can briefly think about whether you think that our new temperature profile either looks like this, or whether it looks more like this, or whether it looks more like this. So there are three choices here. We call them maybe A, B, C. Maybe just briefly discuss with your neighbor which of these temperature profiles you think is the correct one, knowing that snow is a much better insulator than sea ice. 1 minute talking to your neighbor, and then we have a vote, and then we hope that reality adheres to what we vote on. Will the new temperature profile be A, B, or C? All right. Any suggestions? We just have a very quick vote. Who thinks A is the correct answer? B? Oh, poor B. C. Good. I think there's a majority for C. And I think that's what nature also knows about, that we voted nature should behave like that. So C is the right one. And you can conceptualize that in two different ways. There's the very, very intuitive way of looking at this. If snow is a really good insulator, it basically means that this temperature here should know really little about the atmosphere temperature. It's much harder for this temperature to be in touch with the atmosphere temperature. So it should be relatively warm compared to what it was before. Or you could also argue it should be closer to the bottom temperature here, because this is conducting really good and this is conducting not very good. Or the alternative way of looking at this is that you have a heat flux in the snow. So if you are less intuitive thinking, more thinking in terms of equations, as some people do. And we change this to T interface. So there's now a new T interface here. So the heat flux in the snow will be given by the snow conductivity times the gradient, temperature gradient in the snow. Heat flux in the ice will be this one here. And in equilibrium, nothing happens at this boundary between ice and snow. There's no heat storage there. And so the heat flux in the snow, why is this orange now? We don't know. Must be equal to the heat flux in the ice. And since we just said that the heat conductivity of snow is less than the heat conductivity of the ice, this must be compensated for by a larger gradient, so that the product of these two terms is the same as the product of these two terms. And so we need a larger gradient in the snow, and so it needs to be tilted more like this. And if we now want to model all this, what you would basically do is you would use this expression here. You would solve it for the interface temperature as a function of h snow, h ice, t top. K ice, K snow, etc. And then the temperatures, blah, blah, blah. And you would use the expression for the interface temperature and put it back in here or in here. And then the interface temperature is gone, because you express the interface temperature as a function of everything else. And what you end up with if you do that, and if you're bored at some point in the summer school, chances are kind of low, but maybe, what you'll find is that the resulting heat flux is simply given as T top minus T bottom divided by H snow over K snow plus H ice over K ice. And so if our snow thickness is 0, we recover whatever the expression here from before. And so it's a really simple adjustment to our heat flux. If you want to model this or something, you just need to have this term down here. And if you then look at the fact that this factor K, or the heat flux in the snow, is about 0.3 to 0.5 maybe watts per meter in Kelvin. So it's about 7 times lower or 5 times lower than the heat flux in the ice. If you take this expression here and you just put in a very, very thin layer of snow, you find immediately how much slower the ice growth is down here, how much the heat fluxes are reduced. So for example, I was just in Svalbard in March, and we had like minus 24 air temperature, and there was a very strong inhomogeneity in the snow cover. And so when we took ice cores and there was just like no snow, of course, and the surface temperature here was about minus 24. And then just 2 meters next to it, we had like 15 centimeters snow, and then the surface temperature of the ice was minus 4. And so you can imagine if your ice has a surface temperature of minus 4, it grows much, much slower than if your surface temperature is minus 24. And therefore, in order to understand how quick sea ice grows in the Antarctic, in the Southern Ocean, one key piece of knowledge really is what is the snow thickness on top of this ice, because it really, really reduces ice growth. Good. That was your 5 minutes of snow thermodynamics. Any questions? Yeah. No, that's a very good question. So in the Southern Ocean, the melting happens from below. Yep. But that's actually so. So the melting of sea ice in the Southern Ocean happens primarily because of heat coming in from below. And then it's actually nice if you are insulated towards everything up here, because you can't really transport that heat flux out into the atmosphere, so you just use it to melt your ice down here. And so in that regard, the snow could make the ice melting down here a bit more efficient. But the main impact really is that it reduces ice growth. And in the Arctic, where the melting happens from above, snow really is a very, very good buffer for melting, because all the heat first melts the snow away, and that delays then the melting of the ice. Okay?
So I think I understand that the snow thickness is one of the unknowns in the Antarctic sea ice story.
Yeah.
And sorry if this is a stupid question, but how do you get better measurements of that? Can you do it from a satellite, or does this require physical measurements?
Yeah. Maybe we just look at this next when I talk about snow ice formation, because it folds in really well just there. That's fine. Good. Yeah.
Regarding what you said, are there people who wants to increase the precipitation within the Arctic and geoengineering and conquering the Arctic?
Yeah, and I think most geoengineering ideas in the Arctic deal with changing the albedo. The point, if you, and I usually use that as an exam question, so if you ever have an exam with me, you'll get the answer now. What do you want to do in terms of snow if you really want to preserve Arctic sea ice as much as possible? And the simple answer is you don't want to have any snow throughout winter when the ice is growing, and then you want to have massive snowfall in spring, so that when summer comes, you protect your ice against surface melting. So you would have to really pick the right season of the year and then precipitate like crazy. So we could have some discussions on various ideas for geoengineering. One that is currently still discussed is pumping water on top of your ice, so that you always expose your water to the cold atmosphere rather than to the heat flux that you get through the ice and stuff like that. Yeah. All right. So that is just quickly on thermodynamics of snow, and the final thing I briefly want to talk about is snow ice formation. So we have snow, we have ice, and in this case we need some sea surface. And in terms of terminology, this thing here is called freeboard. So the freeboard describes how much the ice is sticking out of the water. There's also snow freeboard, which is how much the snow sticks out of water. But for now, I just use freeboard as for this part here. And if we want to calculate freeboard, we just use hydrostatic equilibrium. So we say this is H draft, this is how much the ice is underneath water, this is H freeboard. And hydrostatic equilibrium simply says the mass of the replaced water, which is just given as the amount of ice underneath water times the density of the water, it's the same as the mass of the ice plus the mass of the snow. And then we know that H ice is given as H draft plus H freeboard. So we can put this in here, we can solve for the draft, and we can calculate how much snow we need to put on top of the ice so that our freeboard gets 0. And so if we do that, what we find is that for a snow thickness that is roughly a third of your ice thickness, the snow is pushing the ice surface into sea level. And so you'll never ever have a situation where your snow thickness is much thicker than a third of your ice thickness. And what happens if you then add snow to this, you push your freeboard underneath water, it gets negative, and in most models what we will then do is to simply turn this amount of ice that is underneath seawater level into snow ice, so that the freeboard of the ice is never negative. And actually, what many people do who do satellite missions, they sometimes use the approximation in large parts of the Antarctic that the surface of the ice, or that the freeboard basically is zero. So they assume that everything that is above sea level is snow and everything that is below sea level is ice. And so in terms of your, coming back to your question as to how people measure snow thickness, or how they measure ice thickness in general, we have satellites such as Cryosat or IceSat that fly around the world, and what they are able to do is to measure some description of the freeboard. The problem is, as we see here, so the only thing you know then is the freeboard, but you have no idea about your snow density, your snow thickness, your ice thickness, and so you have to make certain assumptions of your snow and ice thickness and densities to then translate the freeboard into some ice thickness. And what people are trying just now is to use a combination of different satellites, because one of the satellites, the IceSat, is carrying a laser, so that is basically being reflected at the snow surface because it's visual, and Cryosat is carrying a radar, and if the snow is really, really cold, the signal from Cryosat is reflected at the ice surface. And so from the difference between these two, so this would be Cryosat, and this would be IceSat. In an ideal world, if nature would know about the ideas people had when they designed these satellites, you could derive snow thickness from the difference between the two freeboards and then use everything else to then calculate your ice thickness. The problem is that the snow doesn't behave nicely usually, but as soon as it is a little bit wet, it has a little bit of salt in it, the radar signal is reflected somewhere in the snow. So you need to have some correction terms in order to then figure out where the bottom here is. But that's sort of the most commonly used approach at the moment to get some estimate of snow thickness, but it's super hard to do. And in and just generally in parts of the Antarctic, and I'm not sure if you will still show that ice core picture that you mentioned, about 40% of your ice thickness can consist of snow ice. Because the ice is pretty thin, the snow is pretty thick, and so each snowflake that then adds to that is basically translating into some ice thickness once you have a certain amount of snow lying on top of your ice. So this whole snow ice formation process is very, very important for Antarctic sea ice mass budgets. And I think I want to leave it there for now, unless there are any additional questions on snow and ice and yeah.
So where is the salt going then, when there is so ice?
The what? The salt, we don't know. And so what happens is we have then snow below sea level, seawater drains in either from the side or through the ice from below. And so you form this layer of a mixture of seawater and snow that is salty. And we've tried to do some lab experiments on that. It was super difficult to carry that out, and so we don't have a good model understanding or theoretical understanding what actually happens to the salt.
Initially it stays there.
Initially it stays there, but then what happens over time? But
How fast and how much
Yeah.
is not clear.
good. Then I just leave it there, and I'll turn this off.
90%, maybe 95. I didn't recompute the figure, but 95% would be a good number of prevalence of pack ice. And pack ice is made of what we call flows, and flows is, I don't know where it comes from. It's a technical term to describe an ice chunk. It's like an ice cube, but for sea ice. And you can see a lot of sea ice flows here. And they are formed because actually an infinitely wide ice sheet would not sustain the stresses that are induced by winds and currents. And so sea ice breaks. It's made of flows that are, in most cases, free floating and free to move. That is pack ice. Pack ice drifts, and if you look at the patterns of how pack ice drifts that you can actually retrieve from satellites, this is a satellite image satellite-based image. And how they get that is that they compare subsequent image at 1 day of interval or 5 days. And they try to identify common features with an algorithm that compares the two subsequent image, and you can derive a displacement vector from that, and then you can get the velocity of sea ice. It's not perfect, but it's quite reasonable, and the patterns you obtain are actually very close to winds at first sight. So those of you who are familiar with winds in the Southern Ocean immediately see that. Those who are familiar with the currents in the Southern Ocean would also probably find some sympathy with that picture. You can see several features. You can see hints of the circumpolar current. And you can see hints of a coastal current that goes opposite. And so now you have an idea of how pack ice drifts. We will try to understand why it's the case, and probably try to derive an evolution equation. And an evolution equation for sea ice drift, you actually question why sea ice is moving. You will try to derive a Newton equation, where all the game will be to identify which are the driving forces. Does that make sense? Okay. The first thing that we are going to do is to make assumptions. And the very classic assumption is to assume the drift is purely horizontal. You would rarely see ice chunks flying vertically or sinking. Actually, you see vertical motions in what we call the marginal ice zone, but it's a narrow zone at the ice edge that is influenced by waves. And I don't know it so well. Models don't resolve it, so we'll assume it doesn't exist, but this is not true. But that makes things easier. So this assumption is justified by just looking at sea ice. I think it can also be easily derived by scale analysis when you look at the fact that the sea ice is much wider than it's thick. Yes. And so now we have a 2D velocity vector, just two components. And the mass is actually mass per unit area. And the forces become stresses in newtons per square meter, just to make things clear. So the first force that would act on sea ice to make it move is probably we are on a rotating planet. Anything that moves will be deflected. And so the first force is Coriolis. I hope you accept that. I will not discuss it really further, but it's the first force you can write. And now we'll make some thought experiments. First, let's imagine an ice flow that is in the water and that undergoes currents. So it could go a little bit like this. So you take one of these flows. I'm sorry, the picture is from the Arctic, GB. I told no more pictures from the Arctic, but I didn't find an Arctic situation with no winds. Probably it never happens in the Antarctic that you don't get winds. I didn't have a picture in my collection to illustrate that. So you take no wind, loose flows, only currents. And then what happens? So the ice flow will undergo a stress because of the currents. And by experience, we know that these currents would exert a stress on the sea ice that would be aligned with and proportional to the relative ice-ocean velocity. So that's why what I try to express with this very simple expression, that the stress is just proportional to the velocity difference. And there could be a proportionality coefficient here that would describe how efficient this momentum transfer is. It's called the drag coefficient in the sea ice slang, or simply drag. and it's termed CW, and can imagine it's a function of eye thickness and rugosity or many things. I think eye thickness would be a first order control. Yeah, there is also a possibility to have a turning angle with the Ekman spiral that I will not develop so much now. But if you now take the equilibrium solution of the Newton equation, you reach what we call the geostrophic sea ice drift. So you have no wind. And what the solution says, it's very simple. The currents will entrain the sea ice so that the ice ocean stress cancels. And so the ice velocity is equal to the ocean current. Okay, so that's the easy case. And the force balance is between Coriolis, and you must balance Coriolis because otherwise there wouldn't be a force balance. And it's actually sea surface tilt that does the job to balance Coriolis. So you have to add a force. And so now if you look at your Newton equation, you have three terms. You have ocean drag, you have Coriolis, and you have surface tilt that is required, otherwise your equation has not the correct asymptotic properties. Is that okay? I see. Now we will add some wind. I plan to use Matthias to do winds, but unfortunately it didn't happen. It will happen another time. So now I will continue my thought experiments. So now we move to the Southern Ocean, where you actually have wind all the time, and you will blow on your free-floating ice floes. Okay? And so very similarly, yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's actually the sea surface tilt, not the sea ice tilt. So it's really the slope of the sea surface that would act to cancel Coriolis. It's a pressure gradient. Gravity? Thanks. What is your name? Good student. No, thanks. So, by analogy with what happens with the ocean, you have exactly the same process when you have wind. You blow on your sea ice, and you will have a friction force because of the wind action on the small top of the pressure ridge is here. And we assume that winds, sorry, not currents, exert a stress that is aligned with the wind. And again, there could be a turning angle. I will not discuss that so much. But when solving the equilibrium equation, you have a solution that we call free drift in textbooks, where you have actually winds that will pull the ice, set it in motion, and then you will have the action of Coriolis that will deviate the sea ice velocity from the wind, and the ice velocity in the end will be such that wind stress and water stress will be balanced by Coriolis. So it's a little bit of a different solution. Now you will have the effect that is very well known from early sea ice explorers on, that the sea ice velocity vector is deviated. I think it's an Arctic scheme here. It's deviated to the right of the wind. Okay, and so if we come back to our momentum equation, we have something that is getting a bit more developed with atmospheric drag, ocean drag, Coriolis, and surface tilt. And that was the first equation that first sea ice modelers used to simulate sea ice drift. And they were reasonably optimistic that this would work because, and and it is relatively simple. But then they realized in the 1960s that it was not working so well, and they figured that they must have forgotten something. And today you can tell the story a bit differently, and I will take another angle to keep on developing this equation. I will take the example of land-fast ice. And land-fast ice is the ice that does not move, that is attached to the coast, and that enables to develop this equation a bit further. So land-fast ice, again a picture from the Arctic. We are on the top, the tip of Spitsbergen here, and I'm on a plane taking a picture. This is the southern cap, and what you really clearly see from this picture is that you have the drift ice that I mentioned before, that gets out of Storfjorden from here. And at the same time, you have a band of ice that is attached to the coast and that does not move. This is what we call fast ice. Who chose that name, fast ice? I don't know. Fast ice is actually not fast, it is fastened. It means it's attached and it's not moving. But probably one of the worst terminology choices in history. So I make it clear, fast ice is fastened, non-drifting ice, and in the Antarctic it makes about the rest, so less than 10% of Antarctic sea ice area. And how the fastening works, it's fastening to coasts, it's fastening to islands, to seafloor, and to land ice forms. And to understand why fast ice does not move, whereas it is exposed to air stress and ice ocean, requires to add extra stress in your equation. So you blow wind on the sea ice, especially on the coast. There are currents, but the sea ice doesn't move. So you must add an extra stress. What is the belt that fastens sea ice is our next question. Yeah, beautiful. Huh? The first idea that you could come up with is that internal stresses could fasten sea ice. And internal stress is actually what happens because sea ice is some sort of a solid, and that when you try to deform it, it will react by exerting what we call internal stresses that are actually a reaction of the sea ice molecules, or ice crystals, let's call it macro or microstructures that would oppose to any attempt to deform it. Okay, so in the scheme here, you have a coast, you would have a wind stress, and then the sea ice would react, the fast ice would react by opposing to that motion via internal stress, which would mean, could mean that you balance these two forces and have no motion. And that's one idea that sea ice modelers used, but actually it's insufficient to explain the presence of fast ice, and so you need to think about something else. And also from field-based experience or satellite-based experience, researchers, in particular Australian Alex Fraser and co-authors, and also Japanese groups, have suggested that the fast ice in the Antarctic is often found near the large, very large icebergs that you find all over the place near the coasts. And these very large icebergs can anchor in the seafloor and actually help sea ice to oppose wind and current action. So for example, this is a satellite-based schematic, and you see that the band of fast ice in white is really associated with the presence of these large grounded icebergs that are found there. But this link is a bit speculative at the moment. It's based on observations, And there are no model or equation for iceberg seabed stress that would help to test that hypothesis. But that's the best candidate to explain Antarctic fast ice, which is still a bit of a mystery or a not fully solved problem. Okay, so now we come back to our momentum equation. And we have actually the full version that is currently accepted or used by sea ice physicists or modelers. That you have the atmosphere, ocean, Coriolis, surface still, and you have seabed stress and internal stress. So that's the full version of it. I put it with letters, but you have actually mathematical equations that you could find in the literature with all the details on how each term is formulated. Let's go back to internal stress. Internal stresses are not only confined to the fast ice region, they also act in the pack ice region. The internal stresses are everywhere. They can be measured. This is on the bottom left plot. This is the results, the time series from a pressure sensor that is put in the sea ice, and you can see that these stresses can be very high or very low. They are intermittent, as we call. These are also the stresses that can crush boats and why we need icebreakers. That's the example of Shackleton expedition, where the boat was not prepared to undergo the internal stresses that you would have in the sea ice, and that completely destroyed the boat. You can also hear them if you are lucky. I have a sound here. Maybe that works like this. Yeah, this is a sea ice stress. The effect of a sea ice stress from a tidal fjord, where you actually hear the tide that is pushing the sea ice along the coast, and that makes these crazy noises. So they are real. It's not an invention of modelers. So you can really, they have concrete effects, and you can even hear them. They can also actually fracture the ice into pieces, into pressure ridges, into flows, and induce ridging and rafting. Ridging is the breaking. It's like the building of mountains for the Earth's crust, but it's for sea ice, and it goes much faster. But it's the same thing. You break your sea ice into chunks and pile it into small mountains. What can I say? Oh no, that's already happened. The formulation of internal stress in response to deformation is actually a domain of fluid dynamics or continuum mechanics that is called rheology. So the game of rheology is really to be able to formulate internal stresses. And it's a complicated game because you can imagine that it will depend on a lot of things. I have a summary of the take-home messages that can be expressed with enormous amount of equations into rheological models. But for sea ice, you need an external action that would compress or diverge or shear the ice. And the source of reaction would be the material. So for sea ice, that would be crystals, that could be friction, that could be flow-to-flow collisions. What seems plausible is that you would have stronger internal forces for thicker, more compact ice. And if the ice is loose, so if its fraction is not too high, you would have no internal forces. Once the internal forces are too strong, the ice fractures, and the internal stresses start to be completely different. This is what we call plastic failure. And the equations that would summarize all of this would be what we call in sea ice models rheology. And I show you an example of a one-dimensional, super simple viscous plastic rheology that is some sort of the standard today in sea ice model in a 2D version. And so you would express the internal stress as a function of deformation. That would be the basic relationship that you would implement. And so you would see that the sea ice can accommodate stress without deforming until a certain threshold that is called ice strength. And from then on, the ice can deform, and the stress will be independent of the deformation rate. That's what is called plastic behavior. It makes that you deal with a material that can accumulate stress and then break. And when it breaks, you have always the same internal force. In sea ice models, the ice strength is actually dependent on ice thickness. So the thicker the ice, the harder it is to break it. I guess this is the idea. So this is the topic of a lot of research at the moment because a lot of detailed analysis of sea ice deformation can allow us to refine this model. And there are plenty of people working on it at the moment. There is a big project between Norway and France and many countries in the world trying to develop something more elaborated than this to make the sea ice models progress. I will not take you into these details because I think we would all fall asleep quite rapidly. And also I probably cannot explain that very well because I don't understand all these details, but I think you have more or less the ideas. Now we will be a bit more pragmatic and look at the consequences of the drift of sea ice for different aspects. I guess the first thing is that the drift of sea ice makes the sea ice thickness non-uniform. And let's look at this picture. This is a picture of Antarctic sea ice, a typical Antarctic sea ice cape. And you can see these pressure ridges in the background. You can see some flat ice here, and you can also see some open water. And you can see some very young ice that is actually refreezing open water. And that is probably a little bit being deformed by rafting. So you've got everything here. And this is really the footprint of sea ice motion. The leads, the open water, is created by diverging motion. So you break your ice and you create open water. It's super important for many things because you expose the atmosphere directly to the ocean, and there are plenty of exchanges. The pressure ridges are the result of shear or converging motion, and once you break the ice. So I guess that's the first consequence of sea ice drift, is that locally, at the local scale, the ice thickness is not uniform. That's something that is quite systematic. A pack ice landscape is never flat. You see a lot of things like this. I'm showing here a histogram or a PDF probability density function of ice thickness. It's ice draft. It's the quantity that Dirk used a bit earlier. It's very close. Let's say it's very close to ice thickness. From different methods in Antarctic sea ice. If you're curious, you can go and check this paper by Guy Williams, really nice. But you really see that there are several modes that appear in those PDFs. And of course, you have the very thin ice that is here in black, for example. You have the level ice that would have a peak here at about 1 meter. That would be a typical Antarctic situation. And then you have this tail, and the tail is pressure ridges that have varying sea ice of varying thickness. So I guess that's the first effect of sea ice drifts. There are many others. In the Antarctic, a another key effect is that the ice drift will move ice from where it grows to where it melts. And what I'm showing here to you is analysis from a simulation with our nice ocean. Oh yeah, me and my computer not even submitted. Yeah, that's an analysis I did recently. So that is the annual growth in meters that you get from this model, and you can see more red to the coast, and the more red is actually associated with coastal polynyas where the ice grows, and you see the further you go from the coast, the less growth. So ice grows on the coast in the Antarctic mostly, or close to the coast, but it melts much further away. And so you see that these two patterns do not coincide. You don't have the same amount of growth and the same amount of melt locally, and this is because of ice motion. And a consequence of that is that you actually transport fresh water from a growth to melt sites, and you will salinify your waters close to the coast, and you will freshen your seawater more offshore. So that's a very important, I think, consequence of sea ice drift for the ocean. And I think there are publications showing that this is a dominant forcing in the Southern Ocean. For example, this transport of fresh water has been shown by Alex Oman and co-authors to be related, or a main driver of salinity trends in some regions of the Southern Ocean. This is a letter to Nature that was published a little bit less than a decade ago. And they found that when they were trying to explain sea surface salinity trends in the Southern Ocean, the best explanation was a change in sea ice transport, just via this effect that I just explained. So change in the way sea ice moves also actually affects the way sea ice transfers fresh water and explains sea surface salinity trend. There is another funny consequence that is more and more considered as plausible of sea ice drift in the Antarctic, is that the ice drift actually relates to plankton activity. And that sounds a bit crazy when you think about it, but not that much in the end. One element to accept first is that the growth of phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean is iron limited, and so that you need to supply iron. That's not the case in the Arctic, but in the Antarctic, really that is the game changer for the phytoplankton. They need iron. First thing to get. The second thing to accept is that sea ice is actually a super nice attractor for iron in seawater. It's able, for chemical reasons that are beyond my understanding, sea ice really would attract and store iron. So sea ice actually not only stores fresh water, but it also stores iron. And so when you think about it, you would the motion of sea ice combined with growth and melt would actually suck up iron in growth sites near the continents where there is plenty of it, and move it offshore where it melts. And where it melts means that you could stimulate the growth of phytoplankton in the sea ice melt sites. And this is what is illustrated in this plot. It's a study by one of our colleagues, Renaud Persson, a few years ago. And he was implementing the effect of iron uptake and release in sea ice. And his simulation were showing, I showed just one of them, it was actually involving icebergs as well, but let's keep it simple, that you were improving the phenology of plankton. This is chlorophyll, there is no color bar, but the the colors mean refer to phytoplankton activity, and he was obtaining more realistic patterns of phytoplankton growth. Yeah, you have to accept that this is closer to observations than this. You had no iron in sea ice here, and when you actually implement iron release, you generate more activity where it is observed. For example, here in the coast, you have that mode. You have more intense phytoplankton activity here in that region, which is also observed. It's also in this region, you have more of it, and that's a one paper, but that's not the first one. I think this is the second or third paper that finds the similar story, that you actually bring more realism into your phytoplankton when you consider iron in sea ice, and its transport by sea ice drift. Okay, a few conclusions on this part. I think you can remember that we have actually two ice types that are distinguished by their drifting behavior. The majority of Antarctic sea ice is pack ice that moves, and I developed the momentum equation. You see that it's a complicated problem. You also have this fast ice that is locked by, possibly by grounded bergs and internal forces. It's a problem that we don't understand super well, but that seems to be important. I can tell you more about this after the coffee break. Ice motion and characteristics are coupled, would be my third point, but clearly, next to growth and melt, the drift of sea ice is really the other essential thing that you cannot miss if you want to understand what's going on with it. And it has plenty of implications. And this is a list of things that I think are influenced by the drift of sea ice. It's, of course, it has implications on the sea ice itself. I didn't develop everything, but these are things that are commonly accepted as being influenced by sea ice drift. You also have influences in the ocean, on marine biogeochemistry, and of course also on navigation. I think this is it for sea ice drift, and I think we can leave it there for now. Time for coffee break.
Great, welcome back. Did any further questions emerge during the break? Good, so it was good, then you focus on other things, which is really nice, so you're super refreshed and we can move on. And so what we'll do next is we'll add an ocean to our system. So let's assume that our ocean provides some heat to the ice bottom. We call that an ocean heat flux. Our system doesn't get crazily complicated then, but then the heat flux balance suddenly becomes that the heat flux that goes into the ice is balanced by, the latent heat flux from ice production and the heat flux that comes from the ocean. So we need to remove the heat that comes from the ocean through the ice, and anything that is left, so if we rearrange that, the latent heat flux, which is proportional to ice growth, is then given as the heat flux through the ice minus the heat flux from the ocean. And if the heat flux from the ocean is the same as the heat flux in the ice, this is 0, and we get an equilibrium ice thickness. And so in any region of the world, we will have some ocean heat flux, and that some ocean heat flux basically determines how thick your ice can possibly get. And so without the ocean heat flux, it just gets thicker and thicker, square root behavior until infinity. But with an ocean heat flux, there's a limit once these are the same. And if the ocean heat flux at some point gets larger than the heat flux in the ice, our ice gets thinner. Good. And in some sense, that's, on that perspective, all we need to know. The problem with the ocean heat flux is that it's a little bit complicated. If you look into the details of what's happening there, maybe just to illustrate that, what's this? Himmelfahrt Hamburg, just in case you wondered. let me just... and Brückentag frei, just in case. Sorry about that. So in order to illustrate that the ocean actually is a complicated thing, and ice-ocean interaction is actually even more complicated, what I brought here is from a PhD thesis that we did with Thomas Keitzel, a very clever PhD student. And what we tried to understand is how the ice-ocean interface really works. And so what we did, or what Thomas did, he used a direct numerical simulation of basically the ice-ocean interface. And what you see here, these plumes, this is sort of without any background currents or anything. This is just buoyancy-driven turbulence you get under sea ice. Little anecdote, in Hamburg where I work, we have a huge building, the German Climate Computing Center, where we run our Earth system models. Big computers, but those were too small to run this 30 by 30 by 30 centimeter box. So we had to go to an even bigger computer to do these kinds of simulations. But the structures you get, if you do that, are very similar to what you get when you measure things. So if you, and you can also derive some theory as to how quick your ice should melt as a function of temperature, which is this solid line here. The dots here are measurements, are simulations, the crosses are lab experiments. And so it all works out pretty well. And so if you really want to focus on the details, no turbulence, nothing, it works pretty well. But it's complicated. And in order to make you understand what really is complicated about it, when it comes to having an ocean, I would like to do a little thought experiment. We don't have time to do it properly. So I put in some fresh water into this glass. And we also have some salt. And of course, if I add exactly this amount of salt, we will exactly have salinity of Southern Ocean seawater in this glass. And so what happens if I put this glass into a freezer that has a temperature of -1? Anyone? Doesn't freeze. It'll just, there's a glass of salt water in a freezer. And then, magically, we also brought some ice cubes. And they are freshwater ice for simplicity. So it's an iceberg. What happens if I put this ice cube of freshwater ice into my same freezer at -1? It'll stay ice. Yeah. So if I take both these things, put them in a -1 freezer, they will stay like that forever. Okay, that's the boring part. Now, let's assume that I have an iceberg in my salt water. And I put this thing into my -1 freezer. What will happen? And I want you to talk to your neighbor for about a minute or two to tell me what will happen once we put the two together. If we don't put them together, they won't change. If we put them together, maybe they won't change, maybe they will. All right, any ideas? So maybe we I know it's a fascinating thing. We could talk probably about it for hours. I need to stop you here. It's a shame. I would have loved to just keep this going for an hour or so and see what happens. And maybe just take a quick show of hands. So if I put this in a -1 freezer and I open the door after a day, who thinks I will still have liquid water in this glass? Okay. Who thinks I will still have the ice cube floating in there? No, I just talk about whether there will still be water in here. And the second question is whether there will still be an ice cube in here. A couple of days, 1 day, yep. The ice cube is actually, it's a normal ice cube thingy. But if you want, we can wait for infinite times if that makes it easier. So we wait for the end of the universe, and then we open our freezer. Will there still be liquid in the glass, and will there still be an ice cube in the glass? If there's a lid on and blah, blah, blah. So who thinks there's still water? Good. Who thinks there's still an ice cube in here? Yeah. And so basically what we have here is an iceberg floating in a southern ocean. And experience shows this iceberg disappears. Or what we have in here is an ice shelf wall in contact with an ocean. And experience shows the ocean does something to the ice shelf. And experience actually shows that the ice disappears. Now the weird thing is we are in a system that is -1 and we're dealing with freshwater ice. So how is it possible that this ice disappears at -1, freshwater ice? And we know this is crucial for understanding sea level rise, all the stuff that Nico will be talking about, but also for understanding ocean heat fluxes underneath sea ice, because the solid part of sea ice is freshwater ice. We'll talk about that in a bit. How is that possible? Why does the ice cube, if I put this into a freezer at -1, disappear? And in order to understand that, I brought, just wait a second. In order to understand that, I brought a candy. Candies are always good. It's a menthol candy. Somebody wants to have it? Does anybody like menthol, eucalyptus candy? I just throw it and see what happens. So if you put this candy, which consists primarily of sugar, into your mouth, experience shows it will not stay in there forever, but it will disappear. Why? I can tell you the melting point of sugar is higher than your body temperature. I think we can agree on that probably. Why does it disappear? Yeah? It's dissolving, exactly. It's the same if you put sugar into coffee, it's dissolving, it's not melting. And an iceberg in seawater, an ice shelf in seawater, sea ice in seawater, unless your water temperature is above 0, which it rarely is in these latitudes, the ice is not melting, but it is dissolving. Yeah? And the crucial difference is, in order for things to dissolve, they need to be in direct contact with the liquid. So if I were to wrap this ice cube, which is gone by now, by the way, if I were to wrap that waterproof and drop it into my salt water and put everything at -1 into a freezer, it will stay frozen forever. And so what it really needs is this contact with the salt molecules in the water. And so in order to understand what actually happens at the bottom of sea ice, at an ice shelf or whatever, you need to understand that there's also salt transports going on. And so if you look at, for example, the temperature field, we have ice shelf in this, or whatever, something vertical, at -1, and we have seawater at -1. We put that into a freezer. It's a small shelf or a big freezer. How will the temperature field look like if our water has a salinity of 34 ppt, grams per kilogram? The temperature at the interface will be lower. Because it needs to be at the freezing temperature of our seawater. Whenever you have an interface where the two touch, the interface must be at the freezing point of the seawater. So our temperature here is lower than here, so we get some heat transport in that direction, and that heat is used to make our ice liquid. But it is not a melting process, it's a dissolution process, where it is important that we always remove the fresh water from here, because if we wouldn't do that, there would be a layer of fresh water forming here, and then our ice cube would stop disappearing. And so that means in order to understand what really happens at the interface between the ice and the ocean, we need to consider 3 equations. One is that there's conservation of heat at the interface. We've just looked at that. Latent heat flux is given by heat flux in the ice and the ocean heat flux. And the ocean heat flux in itself is a function of how much turbulence you have and the temperature difference between the far field and our interface temperature. That kind of makes sense. But we also need to conserve salt. And so this is the salinity at the interface and the salinity of the ice times the ice melt, ice ablation velocity, tells you how quickly fresh water is added to the layer. And then this fresh water is being removed because we have a salt flux into the ocean, which is given as the difference in the far field salinity and the salinity at the interface. And finally, we also need to have phase equilibrium at the interface. The temperature at the interface must be the local freezing temperature, which we can approximate as a constant times salinity at the interface. And so we have three equations. We have three unknowns: temperature at the interface, salinity at the interface, and the change in ice growth or change in ice thickness. And we can solve this. And this is what you need to do if you really want to do it properly. You need to understand that you need to have salt transport to the interface. David? This one here? Yeah. So this one just describes that the interface needs to be at the local freezing temperature, and the local freezing temperature is given by the local salinity. Yeah. Yeah. As linear. Yeah. For that temperature range, that works really well. Yeah. Any further questions? And we could talk for hours as to actually why an interface needs to be at a freezing temperature, but we'll maybe do that later over coffee or beer or something. Good, and you can solve that, and if you want to do it properly, you then get expressions for the time evolution of your interface temperature, salinity, and ice growth, and you will figure out, for example, if you don't have turbulence, the velocity with which your ice is getting thinner in this system really depends on the diffusivity of salt, and that's the rate controlling process. If things are turbulent, the differences get a bit smaller, but it really is the salt transport that sets the velocity of your ice ablation. And so this was the kind of stuff I did for my master thesis, where we looked at freshwater lenses forming underneath sea ice, and we tried to understand how this freshwater lens actually reacts to an ocean heat flux. So I basically derived in the sea ice world this kind of stuff, only to then figure out that Adrian Jenkins, a couple of years earlier, had done exactly the same stuff for an ice shelf world. And so we basically reinvented the wheel during my master thesis, but it was nevertheless good to see that it seems to be right if somebody else has come up with the same solution. There are various ways to simplify this. So what is often done in models is to use either a two-equation approach, where you just say our phase equilibrium at the interface is just given by the far field salinity. So you assume that the salinity at the interface is basically the same as in the far field. Or the very simplest, the one equation approach, where you just set a constant in here. And this is basically what has been done in old climate models. You just assume that the ocean heat flux is just given as the difference between your far field temperature and some constant, minus 1.8 or so. And then you might have your friction velocity in here. Good, and I think that's all I want to say for now about ice-ocean interaction, just to make you aware it's not quite as straightforward, to also make you think about little thought experiments and how it can help you understand iceberg-ocean interaction, and to make you really aware of this difference between whether a system is melting or whether it's actually dissolving. And dissolving is much, much slower than melting because the salt transport matters. Good. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Can I come back to the thought experiment?
Sure.
So considering that it's a glass container where we don't have any spreading stuff, if the ice cube melts, would it just create a fresh layer on top, and this layer could then be freezing in the -1? If we don't have any mixture, no spoons spinning around and stuff, wouldn't they just be creating a layer?
Yeah, and that's what we basically mean, that you would put sort of fresh water into the layer, but you would remove that by diffusion. And so it would be probably pretty slow process, which is also why this experiment is different if you do it in whiskey or in water, because in whiskey the fresh water would sink to the bottom, and in salt water it stays at the surface. And so there, basically, what you just say makes perfect sense. In whiskey, even if it had the same freezing temperature, which it doesn't, it would be much faster because you basically set in convection by creating this freshwater layer. Yeah, and some whiskey. Great. Any, yeah. Yeah, yeah, it stays. Yeah, and you mean and have the whole same thing at 0 degrees or at -1? Yeah, then it stays like that forever. Yeah, yeah, because it doesn't melt. It is, yeah, you need the salt to touch thingy. Yeah. Yeah, and so for me, the main difference between melting and dissolution is this thought experiment. If you were to wrap up your ice cube and you put it into +5, it would get liquid. But if you put it into -1 salt water and it's wrapped up, it never would change. It would just, because it will just see the -1. It wouldn't see that there's salt. And if it just sees the -1, it will stay liquid, frozen forever. But as soon as you remove that, then it sees the salt molecules, and the salt molecules change the freezing temperature at the interface. Temperatures change, you get heat fluxes, and then the whole system starts doing stuff. But salt transports matter. Yeah. Good. What about the interior structure of sea ice? Maybe we do a very, very quick drawing again. Where's my chalk? Here. I do this in the corner here, hoping that you can then see it from over there. This is kind of invisible from over there, isn't it? Yeah. You can see it? Okay. Then I go here. So let's assume we have a bucket with water, 34 grams per kilogram. And it's at -1.8. It'll just be liquid. And now we put the same bucket into a freezer at -3.6 degrees centigrade. What will happen? There will be ice forming in here. But the only thing that gets solid in the system is the water. And so if you draw it in a systematic way, not how it looks like in reality, what we would form is ice with a salinity of 0 gram per kilogram, and we would have liquid water with a salinity of around 68 grams per kilogram, because all the salt has been removed from the freshwater ice, and so the concentration in the remaining liquid is higher. And -3.6 is roughly the freezing temperature of a liquid with 68 grams per kilogram in it. And so again, this is in beautiful phase equilibrium and will stay like that forever. And we can carry on with this exercise. We can make it colder and colder and colder. And the colder we make it, the more freshwater ice we get and the higher concentrated the liquid becomes, always until it is in phase equilibrium. And then if we move in the other direction, we make it warmer. Some of this ice will be dissolved in our salty water, and the amount of ice we have in here will become lower and lower. And this is what happens in sea ice all the time. So this is how sea ice looks like if you look at it from the bottom. This is 1 centimeter. And so all these ice crystals here are pure freshwater ice. And then in between, you have all these dark regions, and they are liquid salty brine. And you also have some brine channels. We might come back to those later. Basically, what happens is that brine comes out of these channels and is then being replaced by seawater that enters the ice all between these crystals here in between. So you get convection cells. But the main thing for our purposes now is sea ice really is a mixture of freshwater ice crystals and really salty brine. And the salinity of this brine and the amount of freshwater ice is just given by the temperature. So if we know the temperature of our ice, we know precisely how salty the brine is, because there is this one-to-one relationship between temperature and brine salinity. And there's no way you can ever get away from this curve. So if you want to know your brine salinity, you need to know your temperature. Um, so, another quick thought experiment. Let's assume that we have more ice. Let's assume we have more ice. Oh, we can just take this one here. Oh, that's CS already. Let's take freshwater ice. So this is our frozen road, freshwater ice. And now somebody comes and puts salt on top, like this. Now we have no longer freshwater ice, and it makes weird sounds. What happens to this temperature in this system? Yeah, it will drop. Exactly, because now we have put salt on top. So in this time we did it the other way around. We prescribed the salinity, which basically means the temperature needs to adjust. And so whenever people walk around and put salt on the streets in winter, they make the ice colder to get rid of it, which again is a bit counterintuitive, but because of dissolution, this works out. And this is an important experiment, and you will it might be the only thing you will ever remember from this course, from our CS course, because if you ever give a party and there are lots of people coming and your drinks are not cold yet, you put lots of freshwater ice into your shower tub thing and you put salt on top, because then the ice will cool down to whatever, -10, -15, and then you can put your drinks in there and they will cool down much, much quicker as opposed to just putting them into freshwater ice. Yeah, so this is really important for good parties to know that a mixture of freshwater ice and salt is much colder than 0 degrees. The old Romans used that, for example, for keeping stuff cold. And this is important if we want to understand how much liquid we have in sea ice. And in order to understand that, we briefly need to introduce the so-called bulk salinity. So the brine salinity that we've just looked at, that is the salinity of the liquid brine. The bulk salinity, that is the salinity you would get if you take a sample of sea ice and you melt it, and then measure the salinity in the meltwater. And so that salinity is given by the salinity of the brine times how much brine we have, plus the salinity of pure ice times how much pure ice we have. Salinity of pure ice is 0, so this term drops out. And what we find is the amount of brine that we have in ice, so phi is solid fraction and 1 minus phi is solid liquid brine fraction, is just given by the salinity of our melted sea ice sample divided by the brine salinity, and that's just given by temperature. And so if we take ice cores in sea ice research, we measure two things. We measure temperature along the ice core. We then cut it into slices. We melt the slices. That gives us bulk salinity, and we can then use this expression to derive a profile of how much solid ice is there actually in this core and how much liquid is there in between. And whenever we make our ice, and we've just seen that, whenever we make our ice, for example, a bit warmer, our brine salinity will decrease, and we get more and more brine. And so sea ice does not have a fixed melting temperature. Whenever you make it warmer, it gets more liquid. And it will have disappeared once the brine salinity is the same as the bulk salinity, which can happen whatever at minus 0.6 or minus 0.7, but there's no sort of one phase transition at a certain temperature. And that is the reason why the heat capacity of sea ice is so high, because if you make it warmer, you heat the brine, you heat the ice, but you also have to make some of your ice liquid. So you also have to shuffle in latent heat for each temperature change of sea ice. As basically expressed by this expression here. We can simplify that in models that we assume often a fixed melting temperature. But if you look at the details, sea ice doesn't have a fixed melting temperature, but just gets more liquid as you make it warmer. Any questions on that? That's a bad sign. It probably means you're all shocked or confused or something. Maybe if we just quickly go, yeah. Quickly just go back to this one here. So the main thing we need to take away, sea ice is this mixture of freshwater ice, solid brine, and the amount of both is given by how much salt we have in total in our sea ice and the temperature. Good. Which then means that we can very briefly move on to look at how salt actually gets out of sea ice, which is another component of this ice-ocean interaction thing that is interesting to look into. And it is interesting to look into because if we look at deep water formation sites, Ross Sea, Weddell Sea, Labrador Sea, Greenland Sea, at least these two here are in regions where we form a lot of sea ice. And the sea ice, when it forms, expels salt into the underlying ocean. And if we wouldn't have that, our oceans would be much warmer. So this is from some of the paper that dropped out here. It's from a paper by Stössel in 2002. What they did is use a model, and the red line here shows global mean ocean temperature as a function of depth for normal salt release from sea ice. And then in the blue experiment, they just assume there's no longer salt release from sea ice. So sea ice has the same salinity as seawater. And what happened is that the oceans warmed by 3 degrees, which is massive, which basically shows, or is one way of expressing that we have much, much weaker formation of deep water if we wouldn't have salt release from sea ice. And so therefore, it's important to understand how salt gets out of sea ice. And it's also important to understand the sea ice itself, because as we've just seen, the amount of salt sets the amount of liquid we have in our ice, and that sets all the properties of sea ice. Heat conductivity, mechanical stability, how much algae can live in here, albedo, all these kind of things are set by the amount of liquid. So we really, really need to know how much salt we have in ice. We need to understand how it gets out. Yeah. We'll get to that. We'll just come to that in a moment. And so people have looked at that for a long time. So up to around 2000, there was a list of 5 processes with the general understanding that salt release at the advancing front was the most important process. And a large part of my PhD was looking into how salt gets out of sea ice. And as a result of that, we basically concluded all these processes don't matter. And in the Southern Ocean, a process called gravity drainage is basically the only one we need to know about. And I kind of loved it that something as fundamental as how does salt get out of sea ice was still unclear a couple of, when I did my PhD, 2006, 7 or something. And I always feel that like sea ice research is now at a stage where oceanography maybe was 50 years ago and meteorology was 100 years ago. There's still some really, really fundamental questions open that we haven't fixed yet. And so I just want to really quickly look into this salt release at the advancing front thing, just because there's some general stuff to be learned there, and then quickly explain these processes, and then we call it a day for sea ice thermodynamics. Good. Salt release at the advancing front. There have been a couple of papers, for example, going back to 67, 71, 88, which basically all said most of the ice is, most of the salt is pushed out of the ice ahead of the advancing front. And that was derived from a alloy metallurgy theory by Burton, Prim, and Slichter. And the numbers were usually around 30 to 90% of the salt does never really enter the ice, but is being pushed out at the bottom. So that was the general understanding. And generally, my master thesis, my PhD thesis was about using so-called Machileia equations to understand sea ice. Machileia equations is a system of equations that describe conservation of heat, salt, and mass, and how they all interact within sea ice. And if you solve these, what you get is the result that across the ice-ocean interface, all the fields should be continuous. So the solution of these equations says there should be a continuous temperature field, there should be a continuous solid fraction field, so directly at the interface, the ice has 0 solid fraction, and then as you move into the ice, it gets more and more solid. And if you combine these two, it basically shows there should be no jump between the bottom of ice and the ocean in terms of its salinity during ice growth. So that was what the theory said. You can then go out and take an ice core. So this is part of the field work I had from my PhD. Very thin ice, but the ice core shows a salinity in the ice of around 5 grams per kilogram. Seawater was at 35. I think we can all agree there is a jump. So now we have measurements saying there is a jump, a theory saying there's no jump, which is a wonderful moment for any PhD thesis if you spend hours and weeks in trying to solve these things. Because of course then you have to think about Richard Feynman. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. Yeah. But I kind of couldn't find any mistake in the theory. And so I just said, oh, probably the measurements are wrong. And so what we did, we built or developed a new instrument that allowed me to measure salinity in sea ice in situ rather than taking ice cores. It's what we call the wire harp. So there's a bit of electronics that I had to develop there. And we put that into the ice. And if we do that, we get these rain dots of salinity. And suddenly the jump disappears. Those are the good moments of doing a PhD. And so what basically happens is when you take your ice core, the brine at the bottom drains out, and you don't measure it. And so whenever you do ice core measurements in sea ice, I would recommend to not trust your salinity measurements in the lower 10 centimeters or so. Good. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm just confused here by the slides. Anyway, and so basically, this showed there is no salt loss directly at the front. And so that made me conclude, yeah, we can ignore this process of there is salt release at the front. There must be something else going on here. Yeah. Oh, in terms of the salinity profile, it varies regionally. But no matter what you do, as long as your ice is growing, there's no jump down here. Yeah. And so how does salt then get out of sea ice? And that's actually fairly straightforward. It's the so-called gravity drainage that happens. And so in winter, when our ice is growing, the ice is cold here, it's warm here, which then means, as we have just learned, our brine is super salty here, it's not so salty here. And so this salty stuff here has a higher density than our seawater. And so we have some high density brine on top of lower density seawater. And so this whole thing is unstable, and the salt wants to convect. And that's basically what happens, that we get brine drainage out of the ice through these brine channels, and that's then being replaced by lower salinity seawater as a return flow. And so we have a net loss of salt from sea ice simply because the brine is denser. And this thing is called gravity drainage. And most of the salinity profiles you ever find in the Antarctic you can explain simply by this one process. The question now, of course, is why doesn't all the salt get out? And in order to understand that, we need to consider, and I think in the interest of time I won't write it up, I'll just say it. We need to consider a Rayleigh number. And the Rayleigh number basically describes how much energy do we have available for convection divided by how much energy do we need for convection. And the energy that we have available for convection is just the potential energy of the brine. It's denser, there's a distance to the ocean, so we have potential energy. But we need some energy to move the brine around because it's viscous and also because the pore space in our ice is really small, so we have to squeeze it through there. And so at some point there's an equilibrium when our ice has become so solid that the pore space is so small that this movement stops. And therefore not all the salt gets out of sea ice, but there is a limit given by the pore space in the ice. And so these here are simulations by a PhD student, Philip Brevenk, a couple of years ago, where you see up here the temperature evolution in a new model of sea ice that there's a couple temperature salinity field. And you see how always the bottom part of sea ice is really, really salty. So this is this lower layer where the potential energy is not big enough to get rid of the salt. But then as our ice gets thicker, the potential energy increases and then the brine drains out until it reaches a limit given by this green color where then the pore space is so small that the brine no longer drains out. But what can happen is, for example, here you had a heat wave coming through, and when the ice gets warmer, the pore space open up, and then you have another event of actually brine drainage, which is very important in the Arctic or probably also in the Antarctic, which we call the so-called spring drainage, where you basically get rid of old brine and you replace it by new seawater, bring in all the nutrients. And so after spring, because of sort of heat waves passing through, you enrich your ice and nutrients, and then biology can start thriving there. Yeah. But everything here that happens in winter can be explained by this process called gravity drainage. Yeah.
Because it's driven by gravity, because when you have sheets of sea ice wrapping on top of each other, which you expect a pulse by convection, so it's sitting higher than
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then what you also see, in particular if you look over here, as your ice survives the summer, it gets really, really fresh. But that's a process that we primarily only have in the Arctic. Because in the Arctic we get in summer surface melting, so we produce some fresh surface meltwater, and then we have surface meltwater sitting on top of our sea ice, forming these melt ponds, and they want to drain downwards, and they basically replace brine from above by kind of fresh surface meltwater. And you can describe that by Darcy's law, which describes the flow through a porous medium. And what you find is that's a really fast process, and therefore we basically never have, or very rarely have, or for just for a couple of days have, melt ponds that are above sea level. So most of the melt ponds you will find on sea ice have drained to sea level, because then the driving force has disappeared and the whole system gets into equilibrium. And I think the final thing to maybe talk about briefly about this salt release is related to something that is called snow ice, that we haven't talked about yet. If you have a lot of snow on your ice, and that happens a lot in the Antarctic, you can actually put your sea ice surface below sea level, and then seawater can come in from the sides or from below. There was a master's student, Felix Mutt, and we kind of never published it, I don't know why. It was beautiful work that he did. So he developed this model how the seawater then goes into the snow just by using Darcy's law with capillary forces. He did experiments with some liquid colored stuff here, taking out the wall, and the liquid was rising up to here, but then because of capillary forces, it basically filled all the snow. And he was then comparing how fast does the front move in the experiment, how fast in the model, and he got perfect agreement with no tuning parameters. And so at the end of this, you will have snow seawater mixtures in the snow ice. We don't really understand what happens to the salt in that system. So it's certainly something that if you ever feel bored, you can do some experiments, theory, etc. on. So for me, that is the biggest unknown we currently have when it comes to the salt evolution and salt release from Southern Ocean sea ice, is actually what happens to the salt in snow ice. Great, and with that I summarize quickly. So sea ice growth and decay is described by heat flux balance at the top and bottom. Sea ice and ice shelves usually do not melt when the ocean supplies heat, but the ice gets dissolved in the seawater, so we need salt transport. Arctic sea ice is simple because you can get very far with very simple atmospheric heat balance models. Antarctic sea ice is complicated because the ocean matters, and the ocean is difficult, for me at least. And then when it comes to salt release from sea ice is a key driver of deep convection in the Southern Ocean. It happens primarily through gravity drainage. And most salt is lost directly after the initial ice formation. I mean, you've seen that in the picture, in the simulation. It's just the lowest few centimeters where there's salt in it. And so this early idea that we can parameterize it as a fractionation is not too bad an approximation. It just doesn't capture the physics, but it works well as a parameterization. And then there's additional salt loss when the pore space open up, and surface flushing barely happens in the Southern Ocean. And now you basically know how sea ice works thermodynamically, how salt gets out of it, how ice-ocean interaction works. And you should be super proud of yourself by the amount of things you've learned already today. But there's more. So we have a bit of a technical handover. It will take us about a minute, and then Martin will start moving our ice around. Great. So.